Welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I am delighted that you're here with us today. Also want to let you know about my new book, Brand Bewitchery, that you can purchase right now on Amazon, get a print or Kindle version, and put it to work for you. And of course, the best friend of a new author is not only his reader, but the ratings and reviews you all provide out there. It helps a new guy like me get found in the Amazon jungle, and I appreciate your support in that area. But without further ado, I want to jump right into this show because we have a fascinating guest. He was actually with me earlier this year in show number 234. Sandy Dunlop is an international brand consultant, and his work is based on mythology. He's worked with some of the biggest brands around the world that you've heard of, and you'll meet him in just a second. He'll explain his background on this. In my show earlier this year, Sandy came in and he talked about the 5 mythologies that Donald Trump wields power with. Really fascinating show. Got all kinds of comments on that one. Well, he reached out a couple weeks ago to me and he says, have you ever considered the myth of the plague? You know, of what we're going through right now, COVID and the coronavirus, and that, this is not new to humankind. Over centuries, we've dealt with all kinds of plagues and pandemics. But we are now right in the heart of this awful thing that is taking the world over. And he said, there's a really interesting insight into the myth of the plague, and there's actually 7 things that marketers can learn from it. That's all I know about this show. So I invited him back. I'm intrigued. I have no idea what these 7 things are. And I'm a little bit hesitant because, COVID is a very touchy subject. As you may know, I almost lost my brother to it. He got through it, and I just spoke with him yesterday. And, after he was in the hospital for 6 days and 2 days in ICU, and now he's been COVID-free for about 2 months, and he's still suffering the ramifications of it. So I know this is a very sensitive subject, but I am really fascinated about this idea of the myth of the plague. I want to learn about it, and I want to learn how may or may it not impact us marketers and brand storytellers. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Sandy Dunlop. Sandy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Park, and congratulations on your wonderful initiative. And thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
So glad you're here. You're coming to us where? From Dublin? Are you in Dublin?
Yes, indeed.
Gosh, some might argue the epicenter for storytelling. You Irish seem to know how to tell stories.
I think that's true. And in part, we as a nation stayed closer to the oral storytelling tradition because the Roman armies never got to Ireland, and they tended to wipe out the indigenous oral tradition, and the Irish got to writing late. So the oral tradition stayed alive a lot longer. So I think there's some validity in that, apart from the fact that we some wonderful writers in Yeats and Joyce and Seamus Heaney.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I'm very curious about this idea of the myth of the plague. What is the myth of the plague?
Well, essentially what I think I can offer is a perspective on coronavirus from the angle of myth and from mythic history and archetype and ritual.
How do you define what a myth is? I think myth means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What's your definition of a myth?
Well, I think there's 2 meanings of the word myth. One is the colloquial usage, which is a myth is a lie or an untruth. And the other is that it's a deep cultural wisdom embedded within stories. And it's not speaking in a rational way. And it's not logical in the way that logic is logical, but it has a sort of narrative logic, and it kind of connects with people in an emotional way. And it deals with their longings and their fears. Take a story like Moses parting the Red Sea. Do people actually think that the Red Sea parted so that Moses could walk through? Well, or do you think that Athena came out as Zeus's head when it was cut open by an axe? No, she didn't. Do you think when you fall in love that Aphrodite is in you, which is what the Greeks would have thought? No, but is it useful? It's not true, but it's useful as a language that talk about those forces that act upon us, whether they be our longings or our fears.
So the metaphor, it's a way for us to create meaning. I love what you said right there about a deep cultural wisdom embedded in stories. Well, the stories aren't of an actual event. It's using metaphor, parable, to help explain what's happening in the world around us. It's an educational tool, I guess.
Yes, it is a way of articulating the forces that act upon us. So what a Greek hero would say when they fell in love was, Aphrodite is in me. Now, Aphrodite is the goddess of love and beauty. They are saying Aphrodite is in me. Well, is that literally true? No. But is it metaphorically true in a way that makes sense as a descriptor of those emotions that you feel when you fall in love? Yes, it is, and it's useful. And I think a better way to look at myth isn't, is this stuff true, but more, is it useful to describe those emotions and passions and feelings and fears that are difficult to describe through any other vehicle? So it's a language of the emotions rooted in narrative. And that's why it's so incredibly relevant for brand people who are wanting to access emotions that connect with people. Myths and archetypes are the language of the emotions and the instincts rooted in narrative.
And that's how you create meaning for your brand at a very, very primal human level. Let's also talk here, before we get into the myth of the plague, is the word plague. We very rarely use it. You don't hear it associated with COVID or coronavirus. We tend to call it a pandemic. But what's your position on that? What is a plague versus a pandemic, or are they one and the same?
I think they're exactly the same. It's just that the language has changed. So we use the word virus. And in ancient culture, they didn't have the word virus. They just called it a plague. Pretty much all the mythologies of the world have stories of plagues. It is a universal phenomenon, and it is one of those moments in society when everyone in the culture is affected by some shared traumatic event that shakes everything up and leaves you reflecting on what life is about and what your life is about, in part because of the fears that these moments engender. And it's almost like mythology reminds us of our inherent vulnerability to forces that are, in a way, beyond the human, beyond the cultural. And a flood or a famine or a tsunami or a plague, or indeed a war or a civil war, is when forces are let loose that threaten the very fabric of society.
So the world over, we all are experiencing the coronavirus and COVID, and our countries have experienced a certain amount of economic impact. So I want to just talk about America here. It feels like in America we are going through three plagues at one time, and one kind of begets the other. We've got COVID, the health crisis, which now has led to this unbelievable economic crisis, is kind of a plague in its own right, it seems like. And then, of course, we have unrest, Black Lives Matter, and what's happening there. And we have now people swarming the streets in peaceful protests. And then you got those little, side bands that are raising hell out there, but really, for the most part, peaceful protests. So how does that play into this plague mythology thinking?
Well, I think that the plague is and was the pivotal one in this particular case. But what it does is it stirs up other issues in society that perhaps are latent, certain issues that when everyone's wealthy and everyone's doing well can be brushed under the carpet. But when something like the virus and plague happens, then people are out of work. And then when people are out of work and there's a health issue, it highlights the fact that certain segments of the population don't have the same level of access to health and the hospital system. Mm-hmm. And not only that, they are the people that are in the front line, in that they are doing the service-related jobs that are vital to keep an economy going, like being a nurse or like being a teller in a supermarket. Certain other issues have come to the surface as a result of the first issue, which was the virus, or in the language of myth, the plague.
So can mythology or myths of the plague from the past help us in any way to make sense of what's happening to us now?
Yes, I think so. One of the things that I was going to mention is the great plague story that was the Moses story. And the Moses story started when the Egyptians were imprisoning the Israelites. In the Old Testament, God visited upon the Egyptians all manner of plagues, and actually they were 12. So the term plague meant a lot more than a virus. It meant waters turning to blood, frogs, locusts, unheatable boils, various other things were visited upon by God on the Egyptians. And then the Israelites were freed. They then got their liberation and ended up 40 years in the desert before arriving as the chosen people in the promised land. And on the way, they had God on their side. This chosen people myth that began with the myth of the plague is right at the center of both UK and American culture, in that it's a big idea based on the powerful analogy between their own situation, the British in Tudor times, and the Americans when they got their independence. And that myth is that they've been selected by God for a purpose, like Moses was and the Israelites. And that purpose is fundamental to the presence of the human race on the planet. So it connects into the idea of exceptionalism and manifest destiny. This is at the core of the emergence of the nation state, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the American Civil War. That idea of exceptionalism and God's on our side, that we are chosen. And I just thought it's a bit ironic that the two of the countries that are suffering most from the pandemic are facing a plague again. Only this time, it's not to liberate them, but it's to challenge them. So both the UK and America seem to be the highest performers in terms of COVID cases and COVID deaths. So I just thought that's an ironic, history repeating itself, or, in the sense that their mythology began with a plague story, and now they're coming back again to visit the plague as a source of challenge.
And one might argue that American exceptionalism has kind of gone to the wayside the last few years under current leadership on really both sides of the aisle here. So maybe this is a plague that is going to help shake us out of it a little bit and get back to the good people that I think America really is. We feel it, personally, very personally here, of course. So we've got the plague story that comes in. We are now living in this plague story, and we are attaching all kinds of mythology, I guess, to it. Maybe we can't even help ourselves as storytelling animals, that we have to create this sometimes romantic, sometimes very metaphorical storytelling to make meaning out of it. How can myth help frame a communication?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because there's one thing going through a very difficult time in your life on your own, both individually and collectively. And there's another going through a difficult, traumatic time when you have a myth that helps you make sense of it. And I think the former, when you do not have a myth, it can be feeling of being like a cork on an ocean, just cast hither and thither. And the value of a mythology that helps you make sense of it is potentially helpful. It doesn't change the external circumstance, but it helps you.
But the difference is in how you create meaning around it. So if you don't have a myth, you are grasping for what does this mean, and you start making up all kinds of stories you tell yourself to create this meaning. Where you're saying if there are these universally accepted myths, that it's a way for us to come together in these really tough times.
By the way, there are already myths that are used to frame what is going on. In the Christian community, there would be people, probably from an evangelical point of view, that would suggest that what's happening is a divine intervention. This is an apocalyptic time and possibly the ends of the world. And by the way, there is evidence of locust swarms in East Africa and floods and various other things and diseases. So one mythology and one sense-making process would be within Old and New Testament mythology. Another framing of it would be to frame it as a war. In that particular case, you organize the world into good people and enemies. You typically demonize the enemy. The enemy could be something like the virus, which is a difficult one because it's an invisible enemy.
Yeah, you hear that all the time out here. We're battling this invisible enemy. So that's they're just playing off that war myth.
That's right. And then you also could demonize two groups of people. One would be science. And for some people, Dr. Fauci is the enemy. He's the Satan. You could demonize those governors who are, or people in the health community who are encouraging people to wear masks, who are restricting your First Amendment rights to freedom. You could frame it as a war.
Sandy, do we do this as humans, like without even thinking about it? Are we very calculated and, you know what, we're going to position this as us against the enemy type thing? Or is it something that just comes to us naturally, intuitively, and we land on using these different kinds of myths depending on what we're trying to accomplish?
One of the things that's so significant for someone in the branding business is these mythic structures are very powerful ways of shaping collective emotions. And one of the things that in a way was inherent in the talk that I gave to you the last time was to point out how the 45th president is actually very sophisticated in his use of these foundational mythic structures. And I would have pointed out, for example, the cowboy mythology, which is the archetype of the strong man that comes in at a time when the community is threatened by forces more powerful than them. I would have pointed to Moses. I would have pointed to Rot at the Top and Mob at the Gates. And they were all mythic structures that I felt Mr. Trump used extremely effectively.
They're like Trojan horses, aren't they? I mean, you use them to sneak inside the gate of the mind, and then you release your messaging inside of those. It's because these are such universal archetypes that our brain just seems to gravitate to. Is that what makes them so strong?
Well, I think in a way you're back to neuroscience, which says that people feel before they think, and you can't change feelings with facts. So the notion that we're approaching a product in a supermarket shelf or approaching the vote that I make in an electoral context or a political context rationally by looking through all the policies is seriously questioned by neuroscience, because in situations of complexity and confusion and overwhelming amount of material and uncertainty to deal with, people use heuristics to simplify things. And the most powerful simplifying devices are symbols and myths. What I've seen is how incredibly effectively it's used in fast-moving consumer goods marketing. And essentially what I was pointing out in previous time you had me on is how the 45th president is extremely skilled in recognizing how you can shape mass audiences very effectively using these emotional appeals to mass audiences. The people who try a more rational approach built on policies are actually missing the point that's so clearly pointed out by Daniel Kahneman and various others in the neuroscience and behavioral economics, that people feel before they think. If you know the myths you live by, you at least have some agency and some power. And one thing I was suggesting is that rather than the divine intervention myth and the war myth, that one alternate myth would be, in terms of handling COVID, would be the myth of the journey. And that would be framing what we're going through as a journey where, in the language of the hero's journey, we've been upended from our home ground of familiarity, but ironically, we're at home. But we're at home at a time when we would expect to be at work. So there's something disrupting about that. The issue is, how do you deal with it? Well, in the language of the hero's journey, that is a call to adventure. That, in a way, where we were, our home ground of comfortable going to work every day, is no more. We're at home working. And that is a call to adventure and an opportunity to journey into the unknown, the world we have never been. In hero journey language, it's because there's a reward out there. And that reward, we don't exactly know what it will be, but it will be something that will be of huge value to ourselves. But in order to do that, we need guides and we need helpers. We need to find new strengths within ourselves, and we need to tackle demons and dragons. Well, what are they?
There are fears and there are anxieties, right? I mean, they're just metaphors for all the stuff that plays through our head that wakes us up at 2:30 in the morning, and that oh shit moment of, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to pay the bills? Will my business survive? I just launched a business and now this is hit. So that's that den, the dragons that we deal with. But again, in the hero's journey, that's just metaphor. We're not actually slaying dragons, but we are competing with them.
No, but when it's 3 a.m. and you're frightened and you feel your world has fallen apart, to name it as a dragon or a demon can be helpful, because in doing that, you probably find strengths that you didn't have. And so you find heroic qualities within you. And I think that is the use of myth. So at 4 a.m, the fear about the mortgage and the business that's falling apart and your ability to feed your family, and will you die of COVID, if to frame that as in the language of myth can be useful, because what it then does is it gives you a feeling of agency. It's perhaps different from framing it as a divine intervention, which kind of leaves you a little bit powerless. What we're talking about here is how, if you are conscious of the myths that shape you, you at least have some choice around them. And one of the things you then have is you're framing the journey that you have been on as a hero journey. Or there are other mythic structures like the heroine's journey or the queen's journey or the king's journey that we don't have time to go into today. So essentially what I'm saying is that myth can be useful on an individual and a collective level at offering you psychological, mythic ways of coping with adversity. And I think what I'm suggesting is that throughout history and culture, that the shamanic figures that were, or the bards, would have given a society a mythic structure that helped them make sense of what's going on, make sense of the chaos and upsetness, and help them frame it collectively in a way that lifted spirits, inspired people, that gave them a feeling of individual and collective agency. And in relation to your president, I think he did an extraordinary job in 2016 in dealing with getting elected, using those 5 myths. But I don't see him being as effective this time, because he's wheeling out the same myths, but the context has changed.
Well, the question is the depth. So you can be a bard, you can be a storyteller out there and really understand how to control people. But if you don't have the depth of action and really know what to do, and maybe operating from a total position of self-centered fear, then the power of those myths and all that goes right out the door. I mean, you get exposed for who you really are, and in every story course I've ever taken is you don't really know people until you see them at their worst or going through something that is the worst. That's where their true character comes out. And that doesn't seem to me to be mythology. That just seems to be the way we storytelling animals are hooked together. And to that point, as you were talking, I was thinking of three books that came to mind. The first one is Jonathan Gottschall's Storytelling Animal, which is such a fun read, and it's that intersection of brain structure and story structure, and why, as he says, we yield helplessly to the section of stories as Homo sapiens. The next book is Sapiens. I don't know if you've read that, from Yuval Harari. Fabulous book that looks at the history of humanity and Homo sapiens and how story has played such an important role in us becoming the most aggressive, invasive species ever. And then as you were talking about the journey myth, I was thinking about Christopher Vogler's wonderful book, The Writer's Journey, where he explored the hero's journey in movie making and writing. And I don't know, he's in like his fourth edition now, and it goes into such great depth about all these things you're talking about and how they are at work in the stories that we tell. What I would like to do, Sandy, is take a quick break, and when we come back, I would like to hear then how we brand storytellers can apply this idea of the myths of the plague into the work we do to infuse ourselves and our brands with meaning. You up for that?
Yeah, sure.
Let's do that right after this. Do you suffer from brand doubt? It's the malaise you wake up to in the middle of the night trying to figure out where your company is headed. It's that pit in your stomach you get driving into the office wondering, how are you going to inspire your people with a blurry vision and an unclear mission? That dread of knowing your competition is pilfering your customers because they don't know what you stand for, and therefore you don't stand out. The frustration of knowing you have a remarkable brand story to tell, but it isn't exactly mesmerizing, at the moment anyway. But you don't have to feel that way anymore. I know, because I've been there myself. That's why I wrote Brand Bewitchery, to help you overcome the frustration, exhaustion, and expense of a brand story that is impotent rather than inspiring. Brand Bewitchery is based on my 35 years crafting brand story strategies that have helped companies grow by as much as 600%. It guides you through my proven story cycle system to help you craft spellbinding stories that dramatically grow your business. Plus, as the world's most industrious storyteller, I teach you how to use 3 proven narrative frameworks to increase your influence, persuasion, and confidence. And I even include a foolproof plan, and I should know, on how to activate your story into the world for immediate impact. Order your print or Kindle copy of Brand Bewitchery now on Amazon. There's even a companion Brand Bewitchery online course you can take right now at businessofstory.thinkific.com. I promise you that the storytelling exercises, case studies, and resources in both the book and the course will help you excel through the stories you tell. Story on, my friend. Welcome back. I'm Park Howell. I'm here with Sandy Dunlop. Sandy, before we get into these 7 ideas of how we can use this mythology for our own brands, give us just a quick little background about your work in international branding, mythology, cultural research, and so forth.
What marketing used to be about was about building functionally superior products. And I did a lot of work with Unilever that had 1,800 brands around the world. And I was with one of their European and global brand managers, and she was running 5 brands, and she had nothing functionally to say. And so in a way, her business model was troubled because there was nothing to talk about. There was
just commodities, basically, that her
well, they
function...
become commodities.
Yes.
Because in shampoo and personal wash, there was no technology. There was nothing they could put in to make an argument that this was functionally superior. So what I said is, well, why don't you use these archetypal characters in world mythology, which, by the way, you'll find in film, to give your brand some reason that people should buy? And fortunately, she'd done Spanish and French literature, so she understood how this stuff worked. She found 250,000 Deutschmarks, and we were off. What I've realized subsequently is that it represented a different paradigm, because instead of focusing on what the product is and how it works, in other words, its features and benefits, the central question has moved to something Simon Sinek focused on in his TED Talk, which is, why are you as a brand? Now, I don't think you know why you are until you know who you are. What I realized subsequently is that our business was essentially changing the foundational question that a brand manager needs to ask at the start of building their brand, away from what the product is and how it works, to another question, which is, why are we as a brand and who are we as a brand? And to illustrate that, there is an absolutely classic ad that most people in marketing know, which is the Steve Jobs 1984 Super Bowl ad, which at the time they're launching the Macintosh in 1984, when people did not know what the Macintosh was, they did not know what Apple was, and he spent his $1 million with Ridley Scott to create that extraordinary film of this English athlete, a girl in a red shorts, walking into the room with all these people in serried rows in grey, looked as if they were in prison, while she threw the hammer at this horrible character up on the screen, haranguing them. And what that established was, who is Apple? Well, Apple is the rebel taking on the tyrant. So essentially, Steve Jobs spent $1 million on Ridley Scott and probably another $1 million on buying the Super Bowl spot to establish the who question and the why question. The next day, 6 million people went out and they didn't even know what they were buying, but 6 million of people bought the Macintosh. In a way, what I do as a brand and cultural mythographer is help brands sort out the answer to the who and the why question using these hardwired archetypal structures. And I've just been working on putting this all together in what may be a book, which is called Rebirth of Brand, where I've effectively looked at iconic advertising throughout history and find that the iconic ads invariably use these archetypal and mythic structures. Now, it's not as if you can do iconic advertising all the time, because often you're under pressure to push some feature or benefit. But those ads that have stood the test of time and those advertising executions that you remember years after use these archetypal and mythic structures. So I'm a brand and cultural mythographer helping brands sort out their archetypal and mythic roots.
Terrific. So now take us into these 7 things that we can use as brand storytellers from the myths of the plague.
One of the first lessons is the inherent fragility of human life is what's established by the myth of the plague. Instead of thinking that all's well, what that assumption, the inherent fragility of human life, reminds us of is what really is important in life. Because what we realize during a moment like this is how important community is, how important our loved ones are, how important our family is. But the beauty of what has happened if I can use that descriptor, is that COVID has stopped us. And COVID has, in a way, taken away some foundations on which we were blithely moving forward. So that relates to a myth that I think that could be used moving forward, which is the myth of the benevolent community. Because one of the things you see in American culture with books like Bowling Alone is how we've had 20, 30 years of the primacy of the individual. But I think what the myth of the benevolent community reminds us about is actually we're not selfish, greedy bastards. We also have another side to ourselves, which is about community and togetherness and love and affection. And one reason I think the country I'm living in has been so successful in pulling through and doing well, because we're now opening up again, the rates are very, very low, is we have an incredibly well-developed community structure built around local community sports, drama groups, tidy towns, environmental groups, choirs that provide a local community-based structure. The myth of the benevolent community is a second kind of direction that in a way comes out of the first, which is the inherent fragility of human life. The third is the role of myth at times of crisis, and how at a time of crisis myth can help us through the difficulty.
And it's what we were talking about before, about it just brings meaning to the madness that we're experiencing
exactly.
at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And the night before the American people voted in 2016, regardless of what side and the way you voted, it was divisive. The fabric of the culture felt like it was turning people against each other. As an illustration of what I'm talking about, the great Scottish whiskey brand Johnny Walker came out with a Keep Walking spot, and it evoked two things. And this is an example of the healing role, I felt, of myth. It reminded the American people of that great myth of the journey west that's so hardwired. And it also used that American anthem of "This land is your land, this land is my land," from California to the New York Island. But it referenced an American anthem. And it just had in it people who were immigrants and people who were cowboys and steel workers. They were all in there. And for a moment in that 1 minute spot, it just evoked a sort of place of unity by evoking a myth of the great journey west. And Amazon did one where an imam and a preacher got together and bought kneelers out from Amazon. The point really is that myths can play a healing role at divisive times. Coca-Cola did it with their Mean Joe Green spot when there were racial problems years ago with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Mean Joe Green stomping off, and this young kid offers the Mean Joe a Coke from the perspective, the archetype of the innocent or the child.
You know, my question is to all that, Sandy, are these creative directors and writers, are they actually thinking in mythological terms in that they are looking at myths and say, hey, let's do the myth of the benevolent community in this one? Or is it something that's just so ingrained in them of saying that, I know we want to get our audience and viewers to this point, let's tell this story. And it just turns out to be one of these mythologies that are baked inside of us.
Well, I think both can be true, but if you read the history of American advertising and you find some of the great work that was done, there was some amazing work done in the 60s by DDB and
Ogilvy and the gang.
Ogilvy and some of those, some of the great Volkswagen advertising. And then you find that their copywriters were reading the Greek myths. In that particular case, the copywriter that came up with some of the great work that DDB did and in the 60s was explicitly informed by myth. But the point is that these creative people are in the world of myth anyway. They're watching this stuff all the time. So I don't believe Donald Trump did a classics degree at Harvard, but he damn well knows from running The Apprentice what drives audience numbers. I kind of jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, said that the Harvard Classics department ought to give him an honorary degree in classics because he's applied the oral tradition that was the center of 20th century classical scholarship brilliantly. The third learning is myth can be helpful, helping us through our crises. The fourth learning is the connection between myth and ritual. Rituals, when you look at them, are typically rites of transition. What they are times when the individual is separated from society and their world is turned upside down in a transformation ritual. And joining the US Marines would be an example of one. Going on a trip around the world would be an example of one. And cultures all around the world, the Mardi Gras, the New Orleans Festival, the Venetian Carnival are times of world upside down. And I think that one way of framing the experience of lockdown, it was world upside down. And the whole point about these rites of passage where myth connects with ritual is that it's an opportunity to let go of what you had and collectively come back transformed and reincorporate a different worldview from what you've learned having had this world upside down. The connection of myth and ritual, I think, is a fourth potentially powerful learning. In relation to that, one of the experiences that anthropologists talk about in relation to these world upside down moments is there's an incredible feeling of community and communitas, they call it in anthropological language, where you feel a love for the fellow citizen. And I think it's a real counterbalance to the individualism that we've had rammed down our throats for 20, 30 years to resurrect and recover those feelings of community and communitas.
You know, I see that in two ways here in America, Sandy. It's interesting that you're saying that. In one hand, I would say yes, especially among the older population, and I'm saying 40 plus, quote unquote, older, that I think you really feel this coming together of people. But our surges that are happening right now are, really in the 20 to 40-year-olds, in that range, that young, youthful range. And I can't blame them. Everyone feels completely pent up. But they are really thinking more about themselves and not thinking about who they could well be infecting out there. So that connection between myths and rituals, I very much in play, but you're not seeing community happening here in America in that group of people between 20 and 40. That's my take on it, because that's where the surge is hitting people the most. And when you look at the bars and the restaurants here in Arizona alone, we have one of the fastest growing rates of anyone. You see these knuckleheads just jam-packed in these bars and these restaurants, and they're thinking, well, if I get it, and they do get it, they're young, they're youthful, they can get through it, but they are not thinking about how they are spreading it to their parents, to their grandparents, and having a bigger impact. How could you use this myth to change that kind of thinking?
Well, I think there's two types of world upside down ritual that are going on. And one of them, ironically, is the myth of our shared separateness. I mean, one thing that we've been using a lot of is exactly what we're doing now, Zoom. We have a series of storytelling events where we tell the old stories. Now, that is a world upside down event, but we're not literally in the same room, but we're connected. Our last event had someone from San Diego, someone from Washington, someone from Vienna, someone from Dusseldorf, someone from people from the UK. And that was an example of, I would have thought, a rite of passage, a world upside down, where we were endeavoring to make sense of what we're going through, by listening to rituals together. And I would say some of the marches have a feeling of communitas. It feels like there are people of different colors, getting together across boundaries, because in these moments of rites of passage, the typical symbols of wealth and status are broken down. If you read the anthropologists, we're all one. And in a way, putting on the mask is exactly like a Venetian carnival. We're all one. And so there's both the feeling of love of others, as well as what you described as knuckleheads and selfish people. The idea of community rituals is very core in myth and anthropology. And so I think there are examples of community rituals on Zoom and orchestras getting together from all over the world to sing that are very much in the spirit of communitas.
What's number 5?
Well, number 5 is that myth is the language of our longings and our fears. Beyond our basic needs, we do not know what we want or we need. We only know it when we see it in other people and in other filmic characters. So the language of myth and archetype taps us into our longings and our fears. And I think the 45th president particularly tapped into the fears. But I think we also have a longing for togetherness and for shared humanity. And I think those have been accessed by some of the world's biggest brands and some of the world's biggest sports stars in their out and out generosity and giving.
Who's doing a good job in that?
I do think that an example of togetherness was the speedway, or what do they call it? That Bubba.
NASCAR.
NASCAR. Mm-hmm. Them walking along the track together was a kind of solidarity, which basically, once the institution had taken a stand that says we're all in this together, regardless of our race, and then the horrible incident of the noose. Now, I know it was proven not to be a hate crime, but the point was the gesture of the other athletes.
Yeah, the reaction from that was really amazing.
Yeah. So, there's an example. I do think the large companies have been making gestures to help. One example was Ben and Jerry's, basically the ice cream people basically saying we're not going to advertise on Facebook if they're going to perpetuate hate material. So that was an example of someone standing up and taking a stand, just basically asserting their brand values, which are about community. I think that's what a rebellious community is what Ben and Jerry's stands for. The thing about the myths, this is perhaps the 6th one, is the myths never happened, but the myths are happening all the time.
Wait, say that again. The myths never happen, but myths happen all the time?
Yeah, the myths never happen, but the myths are happening all the time. What we're dealing with is a body of stories that didn't happen, but that doesn't mean they are not happening all the time. So in a way, I think the 6th lesson is don't treat these ancient stories as nonsense. Don't treat these ancient stories as if they're in some way pretending to literal truth. They're not. But if you're wanting to connect with people on an emotional, intuitive level, and if you want to recognize what's going on in culture, all you can do then is to become essentially, if you were in Ireland, the great Bran was given silver branch perception by the god Manannán, the sea god. And what that is an ability through being steeped in the stories and myths of a culture to recognize how the myths are happening all the time. And so what it is it's a language that enables you to see beneath the surface. We call it silver branch perception, the ability to see beneath the surface, to see these, not just the waves at the top of the ocean, but the deeper currents that are at play all the time. And I believe the great iconic adverts and the great iconic and creatives had, whether it was through going to study classics at Harvard or whether it's intuitive because you've watched so many movies, they understood that the myths are happening all the time. And the final lesson is that a brand has agency. It has the power. If it knows the myths that it lives by, it can then make its choice as to how it intervenes in the myths that are going on. And I think in some ways, America has a choice. It could go down the dystopic route that seems to be painted by your president of fear and of othering. And in a way, I think he's in a way betrayed some of the great principles of the Republican Party that were laid out by the founding fathers. But, that's a political comment. But I do think that America has a choice, which is to go down those somewhat dystopic myths, or to do with what brands like Amazon and Johnny Walker and Corona Beer did, and explore myths that bring out the best in us, the better side of us. Because myths are neither good nor bad. They can be used for some of the most divisive, genocidal nastiness, and arguably the Fuhrer was a brilliant user of myth. One of our commentators says the time now is we pity America. And I think that's incredibly sad for what was for many people a country of hope. But I think whatever happens in part could be the role brands could play, because brands, by knowing their archetypal and mythic roots, could do what Johnny Walker did and offer that journey west. And this land is your land, this land is my land, from California, where they rework that anthem that I understand many American kids sing in school, which is an anthem of unity and an anthem of the best and the anthem of the better aspects of our nature. So I've seen brands play that role. Coca-Cola played it with I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing and Mean Joe Green. Budweiser did it with their homage to the Twin Towers when they brought the Clydesdales in and they bowed their heads to the absent Twin Towers. So brands have agency. Brands can play a role in shaping the myths we live by. And for the sake of us all and the sake of the world, I hope that it is more bringing out the better aspects of our nature rather than demonizing some aggregated others with messages of fear and hatred, rather than messages of community and affection and self-sacrifice. So the seventh message, the seventh learning is, if you know the myths you live by, you have more agency as a brand and as a culture.
Final question for you then. Is there a go-to book or resource that you recommend for listeners and their brands to have a better understanding of mythology and how it might play into their communications work?
Well, I tell you what I'll do, Park, is I'll do about 2 weeks work, and I'll finally bring out, I've published the first 4 chapters on LinkedIn, and I finished the last 6. So I'll bring out Rebirth of Brand. Basically what it's about, the book I've written, what it's about is the use of archetypal and mythic structures in the building of iconic brands.
You'll have that pulled together and we can share a PDF or an ebook of some sort with our listeners?
Yeah, I'll do that because I just finished.
Be awesome. So we will be launching it right here on the Business of Story.
Well, thank you, Park. Is that a deal?
That's a heck of a deal. I love it. Now the time is tight because as we're recording this show is going to air in about 10 days. I don't know if that's going to give you enough time.
Well, no, my promise would be I'll have it by the end of July, Park.
By the end of July. Okay. So this show is going to be out at the beginning of July, by the way, which is our 5th anniversary. You are our show that's coming out the week of July 1st. That is 5 years the business of story has been around. So you hold a special place in our show Mythology now. And to be able to offer your book in tandem with this would be just a great little landmark for our program.
Well, thank you, Park. I'm honored.
Well, Sandy, thank you so much for taking the time to being here. A really fascinating show, and I cannot wait. I've read some of your work on LinkedIn. In fact, that was what attracted me to you the very first time when we had you on the show back in 234. So I cannot wait to have the whole book pulled together and take a look at how mythology plays into the brands that we work with.
Well, thank you very much, Park. A big shout out for your work.
Oh,
well done.
I appreciate that. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard and how Sandy shared with mythology and branding and fascinating stuff, please share this show with colleagues, friends, family, and in your community. And of course, if I can be of service to you, reach out to me at businessofstory.com. Go and order your copy of Brand Bewitchery, How to Wield the Story Cycle System to Craft Spellbinding Stories for Your Brand right now on Amazon. Get yourself either a print or Kindle copy, and please leave me a rating and review there. And also remember that we've got our online course that is a perfect, beautiful complement to the book. You can find that at businessofstory.thinkific.com. Lots of folks have been using it, going through it while they've been locked up at home and having the time to do it. And the response I've been getting has just been amazing. So you can use that. Go to businessofstory.thinkific.com. And until next week, when we will have another amazing story artist right here for you like Sandy, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.